Good afternoon, and a warm welcome to you all joining us physically in the room and colleagues that are joining online. It is my great pleasure to introduce Professor Mike Bruton, an internationally recognized ichthyologist, science educator, and museum designer. Professor Bruton served as the director of this institute from 1982 to 1994. And he played a very significant role in preserving the Smiths' legacy and also strengthening the institute's scientific standing. He's an honorary research associate of SAIAB. He holds a PhD from Rhodes University and a DSc honoris causa from the same institutes, and is a fellow of both the Royal Society of South Africa and the Linnean Society of London. He's also an honorary life member of the Two Oceans Aquarium and the South African Association of Science and Technology Centers. Over his distinguished career, Professor Bruton contributed to the development of major science centers and museums, including the Two Oceans Aquarium, the MTN Science Center, Science Bono Discovery Center, Bahrain Science Center, Museum of Science and Technology in Islam, and the King Abdullah University of Science and Technology in Saudi Arabia. And even a museum on the history of the bicycle in Grabo. For those that don't know where Grabo is, it's in the Western Cape. He has received numerous awards, including the NSTF Lifetime Achievement Award and the Malloth Medal from the Royal Society of South Africa for outstanding contribution to the science and science education. Interestingly, the first person to receive this award was J.L.B. Smith in 1936. He continues to inspire through his work as an author, as a consultant, a public speaker, and a leader of the Darwin200 Project. He will be addressing us on the significance of Charles Darwin's visit to the Cape Colony in 1936. Please join me in welcoming Professor Bruton. Mike.
Thank you, Professor Shikona. If I may excuse Albert, it's wonderful to be back at SAIAB. I still call it Ichthy, and to share with you a science education adventure that I've recently had. I'm very grateful to Albert, SAIAB, and the NRF for making this visit possible, and also for extending that generosity and allowing me to also give the talk at the East London Museum and then this morning in Port Alfred. And I believe this talk is co-hosted by the Royal Society of South Africa. And they're involved because they feel that the celebrations we had in Cape Town should be shared as widely as possible. So I'll be talking about the significance of Darwin's visit to the Cape. Now, to understand anyone's contribution, one has to consider the life and times in which they lived and worked. Darwin was born in 1809, died at the age of 73 in 1882. And that covered one of the most dynamic periods in the history of Western civilization. It was the end of the first industrial revolution, powered by steam, the beginning of the second industrial revolution, powered by electricity. A great chunk of it was during the Victorian era. And it was a time of tremendous innovation and a development of a thirst of knowledge in the general public. It was also the beginning of a movement where science started to challenge the Church of England. So it was a time of massive technological innovations, not only in the workplace, but also in terms of transport and communications. The great exhibitions such as Crystal Palace in London, but also in Moscow, Paris, and elsewhere, where the public were exposed to the wonders of plant and animal life throughout the world. There were flourishing libraries. It was a time when literacy levels increased significantly. The novel was invented, and the public became more and more interested in the findings of scientists and what they then called natural philosophers. There were also numerous new museums established or extended. And on the sociological front, there was the abolition of slavery, which took place in the United Kingdom in 1807, and some years later in 1833 in the colonies. And it's interesting to note that Darwin's family, on both his father and his mother's side, were very involved in the campaign for the emancipation of slaves. In fact, his maternal grandfather, Josiah Wedgwood, developed the motto and the symbol for the abolitionist campaign. It was a time described by Charles Dickens in The Tale of Two Cities as the best of times, the worst of times, the age of wisdom, the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief. So it was actually a great time to make important discoveries. There's young Charles, the age of 7, with his sister Catherine. Sadly, Charles's mother, Susanna, died when he was 8 years old. So his sister basically brought him up under the patronage of his very strict disciplinarian father. Darwin was born in Shrewsbury, in Shropshire, and he went to Shrewsbury School. But as that quote from his diary says, school as a means of education, to me, is simply a blank. They were still stuck in the classical curriculum at that time, teaching Latin and Greek and classical history. There was no hint of physical science or biology or mathematics in the curriculum. Also, school hours were much shorter, only 1 or 2 or maybe 2.5 hours a day. So young people had a lot of time to pursue their hobbies. And Darwin used this time to develop his interest in science and essentially became a self-taught scientist. At this stage, his father was very disillusioned with Darwin because he used to go out rat catching and shooting rabbits and so on. And he wrote at the time, "You care for nothing but shooting dogs and rat catching, and you will be a disgrace to yourself and all your family." So those words lived with him throughout his career. His father took the rather odd step of withdrawing him from school 2 years early at the age of 16 and sending him to Edinburgh University to study medicine. In other words, to follow the family tradition. But both his father and grandfather had been family doctors. But once again, this was a failure because he was nauseated by amputations without anesthetics. Once again, the classical curriculum without much science at all. But he did take advantage of his 2 years there by meeting some important people. And one of the most amazing people he met was actually an emancipated slave called John Edmonds from Guyana. Edmonstone had been to the Amazon jungle with a British naturalist called John Waterton. And during those expeditions, he learned the skills of taxidermy. And he offered a course in taxidermy in Edinburgh, which Darwin followed. And they became close friends, much to the amazement of Darwin's colleagues. So the attempt to make him into a medical doctor failed. So his father then withdrew him and sent him to Cambridge University to study theology. And there he did very well. And very few people realize that the author of the book, Origin of Species, was a qualified theologian. He studied hard because he reckoned that if he became a country preacher, it would leave him lots of time for his hobby as a naturalist. So he actually got a good pass, and he also made very good contacts at Cambridge University. One of them was John Henslow, who typically for that time was an active theologian, a preacher in the church, but also the professor of botany. And they spent a great deal of time together. And in fact, during the voyage of the Beagle, all the specimens that Darwin collected, he sent to Henslow, and Henslow distributed them to experts for identification. Towards the end of his time at Cambridge, Darwin started to develop wanderlust. He'd spent all his youth in England, and he wanted to travel. He'd recently read the works of Alexander von Humboldt, the Arctic explorers and others, and he realized that the best education he could get from now on was to travel. Henslow also developed a wanderlust, but he never got further than the Isle of Wight. Now, there were a number of people who influenced Darwin's thinking at that time. One was the Swedish taxonomist, Linnaeus, who's best known for developing the system of nomenclature. But he also wrote that from my studies, I believe that humans and the great apes share a common ancestor. And that's something else that stuck in Darwin's mind. Then there was Adam Sedgwick, once again, an Anglican priest who became an expert geologist. And he took Darwin on the only scientific expedition that he went on prior to the Beagle voyage. They did a 3-month-long survey of the geology of Wales. But like many of the people that Darwin interacted with at that time, he was never able to separate himself completely from the doctrine of the Church of England and didn't, at least initially, support Darwin's theory. Darwin's grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, was also an important influence. They never met because Erasmus died before Darwin was born. But Erasmus was a famous philanthropist, inventor, poet, and an author, and one of the founding members of the Lunar Society of Birmingham, which fomented the first Industrial Revolution. And he wrote many books, one of them called Zoonomia, The Laws of Organic Life, published in 1803. And in it, he makes this tantalizing statement: all animals undergo perpetual transformations, which is a word they used for evolution at the time. And many of these acquired forms are transmitted to their posterity. And that, in a sentence, is a summary of Darwin's later theory of evolution by natural selection. Another important influence was a barrister turned geologist, Sir Charles Lyell. He had just published a major tome, first volume of it, Principles of Geology, in which he totally overturned the field of geology and put it on a scientific basis. Up to then, geologists speculated that the structure of the Earth's crust was basically formed during Noah's Great Flood and a few other large floods, and has remained the same ever since. But Lyell showed that, in fact, the Earth's crust, and therefore the physical habitat in which plants and animals develop, is constantly changing. And it's changing through the same processes today as it operated throughout time. In other words, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, tsunamis, erosion, sedimentation, the tidal forces, etc. So, he coined the unfortunate term of uniform materialism. I'm sure he could have found a simpler word. Basically, to overturn catastrophism, in other words, the structure of the Earth came from one flood, and to point out that it's been a gradual, continuous change. And he also made an interesting statement that if the physical environment changes, surely plants and animals also need to change in order to remain adapted to breed and pass their genes on. Now, at the end of his Cambridge sojourn, Darwin actually looked forward to relaxing in the English countryside, maybe flirting a bit with his girlfriend, Fanny Owen. But when he got home, there was a letter from the Admiralty, from a Captain Robert Fitzroy, who'd been appointed the skipper of HMS Beagle, a Royal Navy vessel that had been equipped to survey the east and west coast of South America and the southern sea route. Fitzroy invited Darwin to be the natural philosopher on board the HMS Beagle. And this was a policy of the Royal Navy at the time, because typically on a ship like Beagle, which had 73 staff, the only articulate and knowledgeable person in the whole crew would be the captain. Most of the other crew were illiterate teenage boys, and a few old salts who'd never had any formal schooling. So boredom and depression was a serious issue for captains of Royal Navy ships who went on month-long or even year-long trips. So they had a policy of inviting natural philosophers to come on board. Now, what was a challenge to Darwin is that he couldn't have been more different in terms of personality from Fitzroy. Fitzroy came from an aristocratic English family, many of them sea captains, and his main goal in life was to maintain his aristocratic status quo. He was against social change, he was against women voting, and he even condoned slavery on the basis that he felt that there were at least 7 different species of humans and that the superior ones had every right to enslave the inferior ones, as he called them. Now, you can imagine how that jarred with Darwin, coming from families which were utterly against slavery. Fitzroy also believed in pseudosciences. One of them was phrenology, that you can tell a person's character from the bumps on his head or the shape of his nose. And when he first met Darwin, he didn't like the shape of his nose. He thought it indicated that he was lacking determination and perseverance. But fortunately, he changed his mind and Darwin proved him wrong. He also didn't accept Darwin's theory of the Beagle voyage, and he blamed himself for unleashing this evil on the world. So there's HMS Beagle, 74 crew, 10-gun brig, specially fitted out for hydrographic surveys. And this diagram shows how crowded everything was. And remember also that Darwin was bringing huge crates of animal skins, mammals and birds and reptiles, as well as geological specimens on board. And Darwin had to share a cabin with Captain Fitzroy for 5 years. And during that time, he slept in a hammock every night. He also never recovered from the seasickness he experienced the first day out at sea. He basically suffered from seasickness for 5 years. So this is the route they followed. They left Plymouth in December 1831, down past Spain, popped into the Canary Islands. Bahia was their first landfall in South America, and then they went down the east coast of South America and up the west coast. Now, what was Darwin like when he set out on that voyage? Firstly, he felt liberated. He was freed from the authority of his father and from the strict decorum of Victorian England. And through his contacts with fellow students and tutors, he was a very open-minded individual, open to new ideas and new thoughts. He was also physically very fit and energetic and had developed superb skills as a field worker through his activities as a hunter and a geologist. And we must also remember that he was far more of a geologist when he set out on the Beagle voyage rather than a biologist. He was also a creationist at this time. He hadn't come up with his theory, obviously, and he actually made a pact with Fitzroy that the data he would collect, he would use to support creationism. So here's a more detailed map, and it shows the complex hydrographic survey routes that Fitzroy had to follow. And Darwin comments in his diary that because of the potential conflicts with Fitzroy, he spent as much time as possible on land and not on the ship. So while Fitzroy was surveying offshore, Darwin did weeks or sometimes months-long trips in Patagonia, Argentina, Brazil, and then later in Chile. And that's where he collected a lot of his data and many of his specimens. Now, I haven't got time to discuss his South American adventures, but basically he collected the first specimens known in the West of many mammals, birds, reptiles, as well as invertebrates, such as the rhea, an ostrich-like flightless bird. He also collected fossils, and for instance, one of them was this giant armadillo, which is about the size of a hippo, which is extinct. And he noticed the resemblance between the extinct giant armadillo and its much smaller modern relative. He also documented how the characteristics of animals and plants change with latitude and also with altitude, and made copious notes on the geology. When they got to Tierra del Fuego at the southern tip of South America, a very bizarre experiment initiated by Captain Fitzroy ended. On a previous voyage, Fitzroy had collected 4 young Tierra del Fuegans and taken them back to England with the idea of civilizing them and converting them to Christianity, and then bringing them back to Tierra del Fuego so that they would convert their community to Christianity. One of the young people died on the voyage, so 3 arrived back, and they arrived back dressed in splendid Victorian clothes, etc. But the experiment was a failure. Within weeks, they had resorted to the very primitive lifestyles of Tierra del Fuegans. Now, from there, from Cape Horn, they ventured up the west coast of South America. And the most important thing that happened there was Darwin witnessed firsthand volcanic eruptions, tsunamis, earthquakes, and erosion and sedimentation. So he collected real live data in support of Lyell's theory. And when he got to the Galapagos Islands, he was already convinced, A, that the Earth is much older than the 6,006 years of the Bible, probably hundreds of millions of years. And secondly, he was convinced that plants and animals must be changing if the natural environment is changing. But the piece of the puzzle he hadn't filled in yet is what is the mechanism for that change. Now, a lot of people think that Darwin came up with his theory when he visited the Galapagos and he found finches on the different islands in the archipelago with different beaks and colors and sizes according to the food they ate. This proved to be very valuable evidence later, but in fact, this data was only analyzed some 5 years after that, when a British ornithologist, John Gould, was able to show that the different finches were different species on different islands. So although he collected valuable data there, not only on the finches, but also on the giant tortoises, the marine iguanas, the mollusks, and the seabirds, this data was only fully analyzed later. And here I'll put a little inset. It was an unusual habit of Victorian explorers to taste the flesh of the animals that they hunted for museum specimens. So Darwin tasted the flesh of giant tortoises on the different islands and actually found that they tasted different. So having had that adventure in the Galapagos off the coast of Ecuador, they then had the long trip westward across the Pacific, Indian Oceans to the Cape Colony. And this gave Darwin a lot of time to start thinking about his embryonic ideas on the mechanism for evolution. And he gained the nickname from the staff of the philosopher, because he used to spend hours leaning over the rail up on deck, thinking about what he had found. Now, it's important to recognize that up to this stage on his trip, he hadn't had a single opportunity to discuss his ideas with an articulate, knowledgeable English-speaking scientist. And that was something that he was really looking forward to doing in the Cape Colony, because he knew that science was already well developed there. They did stop briefly in New Zealand and twice in Australia, but he didn't meet any knowledgeable scientists during those stops. There's the Cape Colony as it was in May, June 1836, when the Beagle arrived. It's basically the size of the present Western Province. And Beagle was not able to drop anchor in Table Bay, because Table Bay at that stage was unprotected, especially during the winter gales. So they dropped anchor in Simon's Bay in Simonstown. And this is a contemporary painting. He spent one night in Admiralty House in Simonstown, and then took a Cape cart into Cape Town. Now, what astounds me, reading the literature written by Northern Hemisphere scientists about the voyage of the Beagle, is how they discount Darwin's visit to the Cape as inconsequential. One recent, fairly recent book about Darwin and the Beagle, written by a well-known historian, Moorhead, the only mention he has of the 19 days Darwin spent in the Cape was they put in only briefly at Cape Town. In fact, they spent more time in Cape Town than any other place after they left the Galapagos. So this is a synopsis of Darwin's Cape visit. He stayed more days here than any other place. He was aware that the natural history was already fairly well studied and collected, so he didn't put a big emphasis on collecting. His emphasis was on meeting famous scientists, and he also did a horse ride into the interior. But it's also important to realize that he'd been at sea for more than 4.5 years now, seasick, bored, and homesick. But he nevertheless put in a big effort during his only landfall on the continent of Africa. And this is what he wrote to Henslow at the time. "Oh, the degree to which I long to be once again living quietly with not one single novel object near me. No one can imagine it till he has been whirled around the world during 5 long years in a 10-gun brig." He rambled along the foothills of Table Mountain and the Table Mountain chain and noted the diversity of the fynbos and also the pollinators of the fynbos. And the first scientist he met was the Astronomer Royal at the Cape, Sir Thomas Maclear, who was at the Royal Astronomical Observatory, which had already been established 11 years earlier, and was by far the most important astronomical observatory in the Southern Hemisphere. The main reason they visited Maclear was to calibrate the chronometers on the Beagle. Beagle was carrying 22 chronometers, which are used to calculate longitude. And this instrument was so important that in a recent exhibition and book produced by the British Museum in London, on the 100 most important objects in the history of humankind, the Beagle chronometer is one of them. The second scientist he met was Dr. Andrew Smith, who had qualified as a medical doctor in Edinburgh, joined the army, and been assigned to the Cape Colony. And there he became the leading zoologist and also the first director of what was initially called the South African Institute and is now known as the Zico South African Museum. Smith is famous for having been the scientist who first described many familiar animals, the biggest fish, the whale shark, the crowned eagle, rock python, girdle lizard, many birds and amphibians and so on. He showed Darwin the collections in his eco, including skulls and horns of the giant extinct buffalo. And he told him about a recent expedition that he had mounted all the way north to the Limpopo and the vast herds of springbucks that he'd seen. And of course, the quokka was still alive at that time, and they would have observed it as well. He also showed Darwin an important geological site called the Sea Point Contact in Cape Town, which provided evidence that there is a third kind of rock. Up until then, only igneous and sedimentary rocks were accepted, but through Darwin's publications on this Sea Point Contact, he proved that metamorphic rock is a third kind of rock recognized. Then, regarding his horse ride into the interior, he wrote in his diary, "I hired a couple of horses and a young Hottentot groom to accompany me as a guide. He spoke English very well and was most tidily dressed. He wore a long coat, beaver hat, and white gloves. He was also very knowledgeable on natural history and the history of slavery, so he was a perfect guide for Darwin." They rode their horses more or less along the route of the N1 from Cape Town to Paarl, clambered up Paarl Rock. Darwin collected granite samples there. They then rode up Franschhoek Valley, where they met the Dutch and the French burghers, and Darwin was able to discuss with them the recent emancipation of slaves, which had happened 3 years earlier. And in general, he came across people who were disgusted by this move, and especially the role that missionaries played in the emancipation of slaves. And it's interesting that Darwin's very first publication with Fitzroy was the story of the emancipation of slaves in the Cape Colony and elsewhere that they had visited. They stayed overnight in the Hoek Inn, South Africa's longest continuously operating hotel. It had been established in 1779, and then rode on over the Hottentots and Holland Mountains and the Cape Flats back to Cape Town. Now, Darwin's comments on this horse ride are rather disparaging. He writes, "I saw so little worth seeing that I have scarcely anything to say. The Cape landscape is devoid of animals, people, and homesteads, cheerless and very desert. I never saw a less interesting country. Now, that's a real insult to people who love the fynbos and the most biodiverse part of the kingdom in the world. But a consoling factor is that he was even more derogatory about Australia, which he found even more boring. But to someone who'd been intoxicated by the luxuriant jungles of South America and the Pacific Islands, the heathland of the Cape with very few trees was a bit of a disappointment. And it was only later in life, with correspondence with scientists in South Africa, that he appreciated the full significance of the fynbos. He did make some important ecological observations on the high diversity of plants and pollinators, on the fact that African mammals tend to be larger than South American mammals, yet the vegetation on which they feed is much less lush. It's basically grass with some browsing. He also noted that large animals had been decimated. And when asked, to comment on this, he said, it's just an unfortunate consequence of Western civilization. The third and most important scientist that Darwin met, and the meetings that are really commemorated in our celebrations in April, was Sir John Herschel. He was a noted astronomer, the son of a very famous astronomer, and he had come out to the Cape Colony in 1834 to document the passage of Halley's Comet. But he stayed for 4 years to do the very first detailed map of the southern skies. And he was regarded as a sort of perfect scientist, a paragon of scientific perfection at the time, and highly respected in England. That's the telescope that he constructed. That's the obelisk that exists now, showing the location of that telescope. And there you can see him as an old man. Now, it was most fortunate that Herschel was in the Cape when Darwin visited, because he was not only an expert astronomer, he was also a very knowledgeable botanist who had an interest in evolution, transformation, and he was also an expert on the scientific method. This is where Herschel lived with his wife, Veldhuizen in Claremont. Unfortunately, that house no longer exists, but the Herschel Girls' School, as you can see, has preserved the architectural features of Veldhuizen. Darwin and Herschel discussed two things. Firstly, evolution, and secondly, the scientific method. As far as evolution or transformation goes, Herschel had previously written of Charles Darwin, the origins of fresh species would be found to be unnatural in contradistinction to a miraculous process. In other words, species weren't created by God or some deity, they arose through a natural process, which was revolutionary at that time. And Darwin, of course, agreed with him on that. But Herschel then went on to say, but if this process did happen, it's no longer in progress, which Darwin could not agree with. And in fact, the more useful discussions were not on transformation, but on the scientific method. Because Herschel said to Darwin, the best results come when the mind leaps forward by forming at once a bold hypothesis. Look for one comprehensive true cause, which could be transferred from one data or one set of phenomena to another. In other words, erect an hypothesis that explains your findings, but will also be useful to explain the findings of other people. And that simple piece of advice changed the direction of Charles Darwin's career, and that happened right here in South Africa. Basically, what the lessons that Darwin learned from Herschel were bring together conjecture and facts, both of them have a place in science, reconcile caution with courage. Once again, they need to be achieved in the right balance. And he appealed to him as go beyond being just a descriptive biologist, geologist, naturalist. Use your data to propose and test a big idea. And that was a central thought in Darwin's mind for the rest of his life, and why he devoted the last 40 years of his life to erect and test his theory of evolution by natural selection. And that is why we had the celebrations in Cape Town. Eventually, Beagle arrived back in Falmouth in England, and Darwin spent the next 6 odd years furiously writing up the log of the beagle and his descriptive notes on zoology and geology, etc. Always in anticipation of having done that, he would then develop his big idea. He was also starting to feel broody at that stage, and in his diary he contemplates the pros and cons of getting married, and he decided, yes, it's time to get married, and he chose as his bride his first cousin, Emma Wedgwood. Emma was the daughter of the famous man Josiah Wedgwood, who started the Wedgwood porcelain industry. And it turned out to be a very successful marriage. They were married for 40-odd years. They had 10 children. She was hugely supportive of him. Even though she was very religious, she respected his right to develop his theory and gather information in support of them. They moved out of London to Down House in Kent, and Darwin wrote in his diary that he chose the property not so much for the building, but the wonderful gardens and wild countryside around, because he anticipated doing a lot of experiments. There's Darwin as a father. He was a very devout father. And of course, coming from a moneyed family, he never had to work for a museum, state research institute, or university. He was an independent scientist who worked from home. So there is in 1942, his oldest son, William. And sadly, 3 of their 10 children, as was common in that time, died in childhood. And the most tragic one was his daughter, Anne. He was very close to her. She died at the age of 10, and her death resulted in him losing faith in religion, becoming an agnostic, and also losing faith in medicine. There's Emma in later years. She was absolutely perfect match for him, supportive, caring, devoted, also a very musical person. She was a skilled pianist who had received lessons from no less than Chopin during her childhood. So what was Darwin like at this time? Obviously, as a result of the voyage of the Beagle, he was now a highly respected scientist with a vast amount of information at his disposal. But he was still regarded as a kind of affable amateur living in the countryside and dabbling in natural history. He was also shy and sickly because he contracted a number of diseases in South America, and that also confined him to home. But he was a patient and observant scientist, focused and practical, a very good experimenter, and retained a childlike curiosity throughout his life. He also realized that the breeding that animal husbandrymen do and farmers and horticulturists do with plants in order to select for certain traits was nothing more than an accelerated version of natural selection, as he would later define it. So he took a keen interest in pigeon breeding and in dogs and so on. And I describe this aspect, this period of his life, as that under the cover of respectable matrimony, Darwin, like Freud and Marx, developed a revolutionary theory that changed society forever. So what was his work environment? He had no conventional laboratory, and even the simple laboratory he had, he didn't have the latest equipment, even though he could afford it. He had a very inexpensive microscope. He never worked in a formal institution, did his experiments at home, but he focused on corresponding extensively with other scientists, and he had a constant stream of scientists from all over the world visiting him and sharing their results with him, and he used them to test his theories. He was particularly interested in phenotypic variation within species, and for instance, all dogs belong to one species, Canis lupus familiaris. So everything from the Chihuahua to the Great Dane is one species, and that fascinated him. He also had an interest in the captive animals in London Zoo and developed a friendship with Jenny the orangutan, who he studied in detail and wrote a book about her communication. So there's a diagram of Darwin's office, nice and cluttered, as always the case for productive people. And you might notice there I've ridden the wheel on his chair. Darwin is actually credited with inventing the wheelie office chair. So there's a typical scene in his office. During the years from 1842 to 1858, he wrote a series of essays of increasing length, spelling out his theory and developing data to support it. And he shared his ideas only with a small group of 5 confidants. And here are 2 of them, Hooker, the botanist, Lyell, the geologist, and also Huxley and Henslow, and 1 or 2 others. So he was bouncing his ideas off these chaps, and they became increasingly excited, and they encouraged him to publish his work, but he was loath to publish for a number of reasons. I'll come back to that. This is the thinking walk in his garden, which I have had the privilege of walking down. And I think a lesson we can learn from Darwin is he came up with his great idea, regarded as one of the greatest ideas in the history of science, because he had a lot of uncluttered time to think. And I think that's so important in nurturing young scientists in South Africa. We need to give them time to think. And there's his famous doodle, I think, and an early family tree of animal evolution. And yesterday at the East London Museum, I commented that this is probably the most famous doodle in the history of science. The second most famous doodle is Margaret Mary Smith's sketch of the coelacanth, which he sent to J.L.B. Smith in 1939. So Darwin, I've mentioned, he was a good experimenter. For instance, he experimented on how creeping plants are attracted to light. He was in the habit of making models of the pollination mechanisms of plants, for instance, orchids. And there was one orchid that had a trigger mechanism that flicked pollen onto a visiting bee. And obviously plastic didn't exist at that time. So he cut a sliver of whalebone off his wife's corset to make that trigger mechanism. They also brushed bumblebees with flour to see how far they flew. He put earthworms on the piano when Bruno was playing to see their reaction, and he measured the strength of plant roots. So his science was good old-fashioned, solid observation, repeated over and over again, collection and classification, but with this clear idea of developing his hypothesis always in his mind. He had an open-minded approach and therefore was able to reach novel conclusions. He was totally non-elitist. He was just as comfortable talking to someone looking after the pigs or a stable hand on a farm as to a Nobel laureate. He was driven by raw imagination and curiosity, unaffected by institutional baggage or dogma. He could write and think what his data told him to do, and he was patient and unhurried. Now, of course, Darwin had to overcome a number of preconceptions from the various physical tests. One of them was the age of the Earth. The second one was a so-called special creation, where plants and animals had come about through the intervention of some deity, and also the issue of that species don't change. But he addressed all of those. Fossils were a difficult thing for the creationists to explain. One explanation they used is that God had playfully decorated his rocks with ornamental replicas of living things. In fact, many centuries earlier, this famous Islamic scientist Al-Jahiz, who was active in the 9th century, he had already concluded that the fossils he found in the Himalayas were the remains of extinct animals. So there were people who influenced Darwin at this stage of his career. Bishop William Paley was one of them. He said all animals and plants are designed, so they must have had a designer, and the facts of science bear witness to the activity of an intelligent designer, in other words, a God. Louis Agassiz, the paleontologist who described the first species of extinct coelacanths, he developed the idea of progressionism. He recognized that each fossil stratum is a progression from simple to more complex, but he said there's no indication of transition from one to another, which of course is wrong. An interesting book was published called The Vestiges of Natural History in 1844, initially anonymously, but then it was discovered that a publisher, Robert Chambers, had written it. And in it, he says, a succession of fossil types is evidence of the transformation of what God had created at the beginning of time. So we're starting to talk about transformation. Unfortunately, Chambers didn't provide evidence to support his conclusions, so he was widely criticized. And then, of course, Thomas Malthus, with his study on how resources limit human population growth, was very influential on Darwin as well. Now, I mentioned he delayed his publication. He worked on it for some 16 years, developing these more and more comprehensive essays. And the reasons were, firstly, he was afraid of the power of the Church of England and its ability to persecute people. He also thought that his theory might actually be a threat to social stability. He was a humble and passive man who had a fear of controversy and persecution and was non-confrontational. He also took into account his wife's religious beliefs, and he was a naturally cautious person. Just a few comments on his religious views. He was an Anglican, but the death of his daughter caused him to become an agnostic. He challenged many of the statements in the religious texts, and his theory, in fact, did threaten the Church of England. And in 1838, he confessed to one of his close friends, Huxley, that he is entertaining the idea of the transformation of species. And he wrote in his diary, it's like confessing to a murder. But the event that caused Darwin to go to press and publish his results was a letter he received from this English naturalist, Alfred Russel Wallace, who was collecting specimens in Southeast Asia. And during a bout with malaria, he'd written a letter to Darwin explaining how, in his opinion, animals evolved from simple to more complex organisms. And to Darwin's amazement, Wallace's mechanism was very similar, but not identical to that which Darwin had formulated. And Darwin was afraid that all his life work would be sacrificed and Wallace would get the credit. But this problem was solved by Huxley, who arranged for Wallace's letter and Darwin's latest essay to be presented at the same meeting of the Linnean Society. Unfortunately, Wallace turned out to be a real gentleman, but although he'd come up with a similar mechanism to Darwin, he had very little evidence to prove it, and he gave all the credit to Darwin and in fact coined the term Darwinism. He also was the first to popularize the terms evolution and struggle for survival. Anyway, Darwin then rushed his latest essay into print, and the book, The Origin of Species, became one of the most famous books in the history of science. One of the first persons he sent it to was John Herschel, and sadly Herschel couldn't break away from the doctrine of the Church of England, and he called it the theory of higgledy-piggledy. In other words, saying that diversity of plants and animals couldn't possibly be explained by chance events. Sir Richard Owen, the famous British paleontologist and founder of the Natural History Museum, he also rejected Darwin's ideas, but in fact was completely discredited by the end of his career. And even Darwin's close confidants, such as Huxley, wrote, "How stupid of me not to have thought of it before. Anyone capable of following a logical argument would recognize what it means." And he even said that Darwin could have come up with the same conclusion if he'd just done research in his back garden. There were many debates about Darwin's book, but the most famous one was in June 1860 in the Oxford University Museum, where Bishop Samuel Wilberforce, Bishop of Oxford, attacked Darwin's theory, and Thomas Huxley, Darwin's bulldog, defended it. It was apparently quite a vitriolic debate, got quite heated. A certain Lady Brewster fainted during the debate and had to be carried out. And at the end of it, the bishop's wife was heard to say, "I hope it's not true, and if it is true, that it won't become widely known." Anyway, that debate was thoroughly won by Darwin's team, and from then on, his theory became more and more widely accepted. So as all of you know, as biologists, this is the gist of his theory: heritable change in living organisms over many generations to change, to adapt to changing environments. And the steps that are required for that are, firstly, that earth and ecosystems change, space and food are limited, there is therefore a struggle for survival, species must change to adapt to the changing environment, and at each generation they produce random novelties when they breed, and some of those novelties are better adapted and are more likely to survive, breed, and pass their genes on, and this results in permanent, irreversible changes over long time periods. Now, just to illustrate what an advanced Darwin's theory was on current thinking, in the medieval time, evolution was seen as going from non-living things to plants to animals to commoners to kings and queens, angels, and then God. That was their theory of evolution at the time. Then a bit more advanced, 1840s, Hitchcock, he came up with this sort of multiple origins of different plants and animals. Then we have Darwin's diagram, and fleshed out in more detail in 1859, showing the tree of life with a single origin. Haeckel came along with a much more complicated tree of life, and so it carried on. And today we can document the diversity of plants and animals in a much more sophisticated way. So what Darwin achieved is he provided the first basic description of the mechanism for evolution. He explained the origins of biodiversity, revolutionized biology as well as many other fields, and laid the foundation for research on genetics and other fields. But very importantly, from the science education point of view, he's improved public understanding of evolution and changed the public perception of science. So Darwin's contributions are contained in that green oval, and they led to the modern synthesis, which included genetics and population genetics and so on. And we're now involved in the outer circle, the integrated synthesis of pulling everything together. I'd also like to mention that Darwin made important contributions to marine science, for instance, the early development of various marine invertebrates, and he did a detailed 8-year study in England of barnacles, which gave him confidence to develop his evolutionary narrative. The time when Darwin was active was the sort of golden age of cartoonists and caricaturists, and these are some of the cartoons they used to lampoon Darwin. But fortunately, he had a good sense of humor, and he actually enjoyed these cartoons. His last book, at the end of a very productive life, was on earthworms, the role they play in aerating the soil and distributing nutrients. And that opened up a whole new field of study in yet another discipline. Once again, he was lampooned by the cartoon. At the base of it, it says, "Man is but a worm." Towards the end of his life, there's nothing Charles enjoyed more than listening to Emma playing the piano. He had a peaceful end to his life and eventually died in April 1882 at the age of 73 years. And despite objections from the Church of England, he was accorded a full state funeral. Over 3,000 people attended, both supporters and opponents. And he was laid to rest in Westminster Abbey, next to John Herschel, a few meters away from Isaac Newton. And Hawking was recently laid to rest at Darwin's side. And it's interesting, Darwin's last words to Emma at his bedside were, "Thank you, you've been a good wife to me. I'm not afraid to die." Now, there are many ways in which Darwin's contributions have been recognized. Just a simple statement from a famous evolution: nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. And Darwin's achievements have been recognized in a multitude of ways. Stamps issued by over 60 countries. He appeared on a recent British £10 note. More animal species have been named after Darwin than anyone else. Linnaeus comes close, and as does Humboldt. And many of the places where Beagle dropped anchor are named after either Darwin or Beagle or even Fitzroy. And there's even a Mount Darwin in Zimbabwe, even though they never visited there. Of course, in Northern Australia, there's the city of Darwin, And in that city is the Charles Darwin University and nearby the Charles Darwin National Park. Well, what do we have in South Africa, in Cape Town, to commemorate Darwin's historic visit? We have a single plaque serially vandalized at the Sea Point Contact, recognizing his visit to that site. We have a very important but small and temporary exhibition in the Eco Museum, which is about to be taken down, and that's it. So I decided to do something about it on the basis of Darwin's discussions with Herschel changed the course of his life, and the importance of Darwin's visit to the Cape is not sufficiently recognized. So I gave a series of talks over a period of years in many societies. This is a ship society, the Shark Museum in Muizenberg. And eventually I started to develop support from various heritage organizations. And we decided that we would mount a bronze bust of a young Charles Darwin, 27 years old, as he was when he visited the Cape, on Simonstown Jetty, near to where the Beagle had dropped anchor. And this famous sculptor, Johann Steyn, developed this superb clay maquette, which it has not only a very good resemblance of Darwin, but also uses the right hairstyle, the right clothing, and even the right method of casting the bust. So there's the process of casting, and that's the final bust, which is a full life-size bronze bust. And there we are on Simonstown Jetty, mounting the bust on a stainless steel plinth. Took us 3 days. We also had to clad it in Table Mountain sandstone and put signs around it. Now, simultaneously with our Darwin bust project, there was another project called Darwin200, and they had a flagship called Ichthyology, which was a Dutch sailing ship built in 1918, sailing around the world following the route of the Beagle. And they informed me that they would be in Cape Town in April of this year. So we arranged for our bus to be mounted on Simonstown Jetty while they were here. So there's Ichthyology arriving in Cape Town. She then sailed to Simon's Bay, and she's anchored exactly where Beagle would have been anchored. And this is the day of the unveiling of the bus. It's Easter Sunday, the 20th of April, 2025. And there I am welcoming the guests. There were about 170 people there. And we had a string of prominent speakers. First one was Deputy Mayor of Cape Town, Eddie Andrews, who gave a very inspiring speech about the importance of heritage. Then Roger Bagshaw, the chairman of Simonstown Historical Society, spoke. John Rogers spoke on behalf of geologists. And then a representative from our main sponsor, the Cape Town Heritage Foundation, Andrew Jones, spoke to us. And he made the interesting point that when I approached them, they regarded it as a non-brainer that they would support this project. And within 3 days of me approaching them, they had agreed to give 50,000 rand. Then our guest of honor was Andrew Darwin, the great-great-grandson of Charles Darwin, who had been specially flown out for the celebration with his wife, Lucy. He also gave a remarkable speech. And there's Andrew Darwin unveiling the bust with Johann Steyn. And as you can see, there are 4 signs around the plinth. And then the sculptor had his say. Now, on those 4 signs, 2 of them are quotes from The Origin of Species. The first quote is from the first paragraph of that book. These facts seem to throw some light on the origin of species, that mystery of mysteries, as it has been called by one of our greatest philosophers. And here Darwin is referring to his discussions with John Herschel in the Cape. Those discussions are so important, they're mentioned in the first paragraph of The Origin of Species. And then in the last paragraph of that book, he ends it by saying, there's grandeur in this view of life, originally breathed into a few forms or into one, and that from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved. So we also produced a sign with educational information on it. And there's a close-up of the sign giving further information on the visit to Simonstown, Ichthyology, on John Herschel. And it's got a QR code, and if you scan that code, you can read copies of the main speeches made at the unveiling ceremony. So there's the bust on its plinth with the sign, and you're all, I'm sure, know where Just Nuisance's statue is on Jubilee Square. That Simon's Town Jetty, and that's where the Darwin statue is there. And on the opposite side of the end of the jetty is another statue of a Navy standby diver. And this is my dog Dingo. And just as a bit of light-hearted entertainment, at the opening ceremony, there was a gentleman who went to the same school as Darwin, Shrewsbury High, and he draped a Shrewsbury tie around Darwin. And there I am with an old Rhodes University friend of mine, Ted Grubicki, giving Darwin a quaff of beer after a long, hard day. Another project that took place simultaneously from the Darwin200 Project is the Darwin Leaders Program. These were 10 young researchers from all over Africa who did research on conservation issues in the Western Cape during April. And they presented their results in Simonstown and then again at the Two Oceans Aquarium on the V&A waterfront. And that was a very exciting program. Some superb results came out of it. And then there were two other activities we had. The one was a new play was produced called Darwin, A Curious Mind, by two famous South African actors, Nicholas Ellenbogen and his wife Liz. And the script was written by Sir Alexander McCall Smith, the famous Scottish author. The third actor in the play was a young man, Andrew Rue. And the marvelous thing about this play, here you can see them in rehearsal, is during the whole play, the young Darwin and the old Darwin were on stage at the same time. So one had banter between them, looking back, looking forward, and at times it's quite hilarious. And it was a very satisfying feeling seeing this play come together, because I believe performing arts is one of the most powerful ways to convey scientific messages. So there they are performing the play. It was performed to sold-out audiences in Galloway Theatre and also in Simonstown with standing ovations. And then the other activity we organised was an art exhibition called The Art of Evolution, the Evolution of Art, the Art at Africa Gallery on the V&A waterfront. Once again, Andrew Darwin opened it, and some wonderful artworks were produced. 42 different artworks by 21 artists in 11 media. And there's some other examples. A few other things happened. This is a temporary exhibition I mounted in the Simonstown Museum on the story behind the Darwin bust. The Owl Club, which is a cultural society in Cape Town, hosted the Darwins and crew members from Oosterschelde. They gave talks. I mounted an exhibition on the Beagle there, and we also had excursions to the sailing ship. We also took the Darwins to the Sea Point Contact, and here a geologist is explaining the significance of Darwin's findings there. We took them to the Ezekiel Museum, and there Andrew is pointing out where he fits in the Darwin family tree. And then finally, we took them to the Royal Observatory, and there Lucy found in the storeroom a clock made by her grandfather called the Kohlberg clock, and she has agreed to cover the cost of refurbishing that clock. I also retraced the Darwin's horseback ride. I did it by car, and we've created a little documentary on that. And this is the final wrap-up meeting in the Observatory Cafe. Crazy bunch of people from the USA, Chile, England, Australia, South Africa, who put it all together. We raised about 200,000 Rand. These are our major sponsors that made it possible. And the nature of the celebrations, and this is really how I think all science should be celebrated. It was a multidisciplinary celebration. We celebrated biology and geology and history of science, but also cultural heritage, and we used performing arts, poetry, fine art, music, and film for the celebrations. There were 21 different events in April involving 42 institutions and a large number of individual participants. There were other outcomes. For instance, 500 boxes of educational books are currently being distributed to schools and museums through South Africa. The Geoheritage Group of the Geological Society has been revitalized, and a number of people are now giving talks on Darwin. And our future activities include developing a nest egg for maintaining the bust, making the Zika exhibition permanent, promoting visits to the Darwin bust, and developing the Simonstown Jetty as a permanent Simonstown Hall of Fame. And we're also redeveloping the Darwin Trail, which was first developed in 2009 and then fell away. We're also selling the bronze bust to raise money to maintain the main bust. And there on the table, you can see one of the mini busts that's on sale. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike. What a beautiful presentation. Thanks, Mike, for finding the time to share your incredible knowledge with all of us. I can't wait to retire myself. Well synthesized. We can invite questions from people in the room and also online, like people assistance. Yes,
Yes, I've got a few questions. Oh, yes. I've got a few, Lusanda here from SAIAB. I've got a few questions in terms of Darwin. The first one is the funding of those trips at that particular time. Secondly, my second question was partially answered. It was in a time when there were no vaccines, I should believe. And he traveled all over the world, of which he got sick only on the South America. Are there any other places where he got sick? Because I believe in today's world, when you cross the border, you are susceptible of viruses.
The hydrographic survey of HMS Beagle was funded by the Royal Navy and the Admiralty. Darwin's costs on the voyage were covered by his father, Robert Darwin. Okay, so that's how that was funded. In terms of Darwin's health, he was bitten by a beetle, which gave him Lagos disease, which is a debilitating disease. It makes you fatigued and lose energy and so on. And he suffered from that throughout his life. But he probably had all sorts of other things which weren't properly diagnosed. They did have a medical doctor on board Beagle for part of the voyage, but that doctor wasn't able to diagnose or treat Darwin properly. So, like a lot of those early travelers, many of whom died at sea, he became quite severely diseased, and medical practice wasn't good enough, to cure it. Another question I'm often asked is, surely Darwin should have known better than to marry his first cousin, because inbreeding could create problems. And Darwin himself knew enough about genetics, even though Mendel's work hadn't as yet come to his attention, to worry about that. But in fact, subsequent diagnoses have revealed that his three children didn't die as a result of inbreeding.
Last question. Thank you, Richard. Last question. How did he survive not burning at the stake like the main scientists at the time or before that time and being persecuted?
Sorry, I didn't catch the first part of that question.
How did he survive not being burnt at the stake?
Well, because the way had been softened a bit for him by the publication of that book on vestiges of evolution. And evolution and transformation was actually quite a big topic of discussion already at the time his book came out. So it wasn't a complete revelation. If he'd come up with that a century earlier, he could well have been burnt at the stake. But, the public opinion was quite quickly on his side, because people realized that evolution had taken place, no one knew how, and they realized how important it was to know the mechanism. And then he came up with the mechanism, which was widely accepted, firstly by scientists and then by the public.
Any further questions? Anyone? Open mic? Yes, open.
Thanks for a very interesting talk, Mike. Darwin came up with evolution, but who coined the word? Who coined
Sorry?
the word evolution?
Yeah.
Was it him? Was it him or somebody else?
Who came up with the word evolution?
Oh, no, he used the word transformation, and it was Wallace who popularized the term evolution, struggle for survival, and coined the term Darwinism. So although evolution is hinted at throughout the origin of species, it was only in his later publications that he used that word consistently.
Okay. Any further questions? I think that was really nice and straightforward. I really enjoyed that, Mike. It took me back to many years ago when I was, sitting in the lecture hall. I wish we could have more of these lectures, and we thank you for, finding the time to fly out from Cape Town and, come and share your knowledge with us, and with our students.
And I gather that this is a Smith Memorial Lecture, and it's a real honor to give that lecture. I think, other than Jean Pote, I'm probably the last surviving person who worked with J.L.B. and Margaret. It was a wonderful opportunity, and it's fantastic to see how you're building on their legacy. And before we break, I'd like to present you with something of it. We've corresponded about it, but I gave a talk on Darwin in Hermanus to the UPA there a while ago. And an elderly woman came up to me and she said, I've got a book about fishes and I'd like to give it to you, and you can do, what you feel is best about it. It's a book in Russian about Russian fishes, beautifully illustrated, published in 1948. And it was originally given to a famous South African fisheries officer, G.G. Duplessis, in Rome, at a conference in Rome. And I'd like to formally hand this over and donate it to SAIAB.
Thank you. To our students and researchers, another piece of nice literature here for you. Mike, before we step off the stage, I just wanted to say to you that our students and researchers do have ample time to think. You mentioned earlier that. Thank you much. There's some refreshments next door, so that we can also engage in each other. Thank you so much, everyone.